stars explode in the quiet night.
The air on Chromia was a thick, wet blanket, heavy with the scent of life and death. Dr. Aris Thorne sucked in a breath through his filtration mask, the processed air doing little to cut the dizzying cocktail of cloying sweetness, sharp citrus, and the unnerving, coppery tang of something metallic. It was the smell of a world where plants didn't just grow, they hunted. Above him, the dense, multi-layered canopy formed a fractured ceiling, a tapestry of emerald, violet, and gold. It filtered the intense, dual-spectrum radiation from Flora Lux, the system's volatile young star, into a perpetual, shimmering twilight. Beams of raw UV and infrared light speared through the gaps, casting long, distorted shadows and making the alien foliage glow with an internal, feverish energy. Aris snapped his bioscanner shut with a definitive click, the sound swallowed by the low hum of the jungle. A bead of sweat traced a path through the grime, and pollen caked on his temple. He was a xenobotanist, a man who had studied alien flora for 15 years, but Chromia was something else entirely. This wasn't a garden, it was an arsenal. Whisper, confirm one more time. No signs of large fauna, just plants. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible over the rustle of leaves that seemed a little too deliberate. The smooth, synthetic voice of his ship's AI, routed through the comm implant in his mastoid bone, responded instantly. Confirmed, Doctor. Chromia's biosphere is overwhelmingly fluorocentric. Fauna is limited to microscale pollinators and symbionts. The dominant flora, however, exhibits extreme levels of mobility, sensory perception, and sophisticated defensive and predatory adaptations. Caution level, extreme. Extreme, Aris muttered, wiping a gloved hand across his visor. You don't say. He was here on a standard, if high-risk, exobiology survey mission. The initial orbital scans had shown a world teeming with complex, previously unclassified plant life. A xenobotanist's dream. The reality was proving to be more of a carefully camouflaged nightmare. He nudged a fern-like frond aside with the reinforced butt of his scanner. The plant, a deep jade green with silver veins, didn't just bend. It recoiled, snapping back with a whip-crack sound, revealing serrated edges along its stem that glistened with a viscous, amber fluid. He'd catalogued it yesterday, blade reed. Highly motile, hypersensitive to touch, edges capable of slicing through durasteel mesh. Further on, a cluster of enormous, trumpet-shaped flowers, lure blooms, pulsed with a hypnotic, shifting pattern of magenta, gold, and deep blue. The scent emanating from them was so overpoweringly sweet, it made his head swim even through the filter. Whisper's initial analysis had flagged potential neuroactive pollen, a cloud of psychotropic mist that could leave a victim paralyzed and blissfully unaware as the plant's digestive roots slowly enveloped them. This was the bladereed forest, one of the most aggressive biomes on Chromia. Every step was a calculated risk, every shadow a potential trigger. His boot crunched on something brittle and unexpected. He looked down, his heart giving a nervous lurch. The mossy ground was littered with shattered crystalline shards, glowing with a faint, internal purple light. They were embedded in the thick, grey bark of a nearby tree-like growth, which showed clear signs of decay, blackened, withered patches spreading from the points of contact like a gangrenous wound. This was new. This wasn't in the initial scans. Whisper analyzed these shards, full spectral and compositional workup. He knelt, careful not to touch anything, and unsnapped his scanner again. A thin, blue laser swept over the fragments. Analysis initiated, complete. Substance identified, crystalline parasite. Designation, blight variant. Composition, organosilicate matrix, emitting low-level disruptive energy signature and antiphytochemicals. Conclusion, aggressive, infectious agent. Host flora is being systematically decomposed. A parasite, a crystal parasite eating the jungle. The implications were staggering. Before he could process them, before he could even stand, the forest erupted. It was a symphony of motion, silent and terrifyingly efficient. Vines thicker than his arm, draped innocently from the canopy high above, became constricting cables, snaking down with whiplash speed. Mossy tendrils, previously indistinguishable from the forest floor, erupted around his ankles, coiling like living rope and yanking his feet from under him. Aris grunted in surprise and pain, instinctively grabbing for the multi-tool on his belt. Whisper, emergency extract. His command was cut short as a main vine, studded with sucker-like nodes, wrapped around his torso, pinning his arms to his sides. The multi-tool was knocked from his grasp, disappearing into the undergrowth. He was hoisted unceremoniously off the ground, dangling 2 meters in the air. The world tilted, a kaleidoscope of hostile green. Then a thick, sticky cloud of iridescent pollen erupted from a cluster of bulbous pods he hadn't even noticed overhead. It coated his visor, plunging his world into a hazy, golden gloom. It gummed up the seals of his environment suit and the joints of his gloves, rendering his remaining tech useless. Through the sticky haze, shapes emerged from the vibrant foliage. They moved with a fluid, silent grace that was utterly alien. They were tall, roughly humanoid, but composed entirely of plant matter. One was a walking bouquet of iridescent blue orchids, its head a cluster of large, dark, pupil-less eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Its limbs were slender stalks, and it moved with a delicate, swaying motion. Another was a brutal tangle of thorny, black vines woven tightly around a core of glowing amber sap that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. Its limbs ended in sharp, woody claws that clicked together as it moved. A third seemed sculpted from polished, dark green bark, its surface adorned with intricate, shifting patterns of bioluminescent moss that formed what looked like musculature. It was bulkier, more powerful than the others. Florans, the dominant sentient species of Chromia, Whisper's briefings had been theoretical, based on distant observations. They communicated not with sound, but with rapid pulses of light across their bodies and subtle shifts in the pigments of their petals or bark. Seeing them now in the furious flesh was terrifying. The orchid Floran stepped forward. Its movements were eerily silent. A long, whip-like vine, tipped with a venomous-looking black thorn, extended from its arm. It pointed the thorn directly at Aris's face, the tip hovering just centimeters from his visor. Then, with a sharp, deliberate motion, it swept the thorn towards the glittering shards of the parasite on the ground. A cascade of angry, accusatory indigo light pulsed across its floral body. The other Florans responded with flashes of their own, scarlet from the thorned one, agitated yellow from the bark-covered one. The meaning was unmistakable. You did this. They think I brought it, Aris realized with a dawning horror that chilled him to the bone. They think the tech, the scanner, they think I'm the blight." He tried to gesture, to shake his head, to communicate his innocence with his pinned hands and body. He pointed a clumsy, gloved finger towards his discarded scanner, then away from himself, towards the jungle at large. The gestures seemed pathetic, meaningless, a series of frantic, random twitches. The thorn Floran made a sharp, grating sound, wood rasping on wood, a sound of pure aggression. In response, the vines tightened their grip, squeezing the air from his lungs. A thorn dug into his shoulder, piercing the environment suit and eliciting a sharp gasp of pain. He was dragged, dangling and helpless, deeper into the alien jungle. The Floran guards moved with purpose, their light pulses a constant, agitated stream. They ignored his struggles. The journey was a blur of forced perspective and rising dread. He caught glimpses of breathtaking beauty, a waterfall cascading over a living rock formation covered in phosphorescent lichen, a grove of trees with leaves of pure silver that chimed softly in the breeze, but it was all seen through the lens of a prisoner on a death march. And everywhere he saw more signs of the glitter blight, a patch of vibrant, orange fungus crusted over with sickly purple crystal crumbling to dust. A magnificent, towering tree whose upper branches were sheathed in the purple shards, its leaves falling in a silent, mournful rain. The further they went, the denser the infection became, a spreading sickness in the heart of the vibrant jungle. The Florans' light patterns grew more frantic, more fearful. Finally, they emerged from the oppressive thickness of the blade-reed forest into a vast, open clearing. The sight that met Aris's eyes made him forget, for a moment, his own predicament. It was a cathedral of nature, and at its center stood the heart of it all. The Grove Mother. Her trunk was wider than a city block, a colossal pillar of life that disappeared into the misty heights of the upper canopy thousands of meters above. Her bark was deeply fissured, like the lines on an ancient face, and it glowed with a soft, internal golden light that pulsed with the slow, steady rhythm of a sleeping giant. Vast branches, each the size of a redwood, stretched outwards, supporting entire ecosystems of smaller plants, fungi, and glowing mosses. The air itself hummed with a palpable energy, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in Aris's bones and teeth. This was not just a tree, it was the nexus of Chromia's biosphere. And at her ancient, sacred base, spreading like a cancerous, weeping scar, was a massive infestation of glitter blight. Thick, jagged purple crystals, some as tall as Aris himself, erupted from the sacred bark. They pulsed with a malevolent, syncopated energy, their light fighting the Grove Mother's gentle gold. The area around the infection was blackened and withered. The golden light flickered weakly like a failing heart. Dozens of Florans surrounded the base, their efforts a picture of desperate, futile devotion. Some sprayed thick, amber sap from glands in their bodies onto the crystals. It sizzled and smoked, but the crystals remained, largely unaffected. Others attempted to pry shards loose with hardened, root-like digits, only to have the brittle crystals snap and embed themselves deeper into the Grove Mother's flesh. It was a losing battle. A silent, light-filled scream of anguish filled the clearing. Aris was dumped unceremoniously onto the soft, mossy ground before a particularly imposing Floran. This one seemed ancient, its body a complex, gnarled lattice of silver-barked wood, twisted and knotted with age, intertwined with luminous white flowers that glowed with the pure light of stars. Its face was a pattern of deep knots and glowing moss that formed stern, watchful eyes radiating an immense, heavy sorrow. The elder root. Light pulsed across the elder's form in complex, deliberate patterns directed at the orchid captor. A rapid, silent conversation ensued, a flickering debate in color and shape. The orchid Floran gestured vehemently at Aris, then at his useless, pollen-gummed tech lying in a heap nearby. Its light pulses were sharp, red-tipped with accusation. The elder root's gaze, ancient and heavy with the weight of a dying world, finally settled on Aris. The sorrow in those glowing moss eyes was a physical force. It raised a gnarled, root-like limb. Light pulsed from its core in a distinct, deliberate sequence that transcended language, a shimmering question mark of pure white light, followed by a perfect, miniature holographic image of the glitter blight shard, which then morphed into an unmistakable silhouette of Aris himself. The question hung in the air, silent and profound. "You, blight, connected." Then the elder pointed a slow, deliberate finger at the dying Grove Mother and back at Aris. The meaning was clear. Can you fix this? Can you stop what is killing her? Aris's mind raced. His tech was gone. He was a prisoner, but he was also a scientist, and he saw the problem with devastating clarity. He saw the desperation in the flickering lights of the Florans, the grief in their slumped postures. He met the elder root's gaze, and with all the conviction he could muster, nodded slowly, emphatically. He pointed at the grotesque glitter blight infestation, made a sharp, cutting motion across his own throat, and then pointed firmly at his own chest. I will help kill it." The elder root studied him, the star-like flowers on its body dimming and brightening in contemplation. The silence in the clearing was absolute, broken only by the faint, pained thrum of the Grove Mother. Every Floran had stilled, their lights frozen mid-pulse, waiting. Then a single, slow, deliberate pulse of soft, white light emanated from the elder's core. It was not a pulse of joy or of trust, but of acceptance, conditional, a desperate gamble. The vines holding Aris loosened, falling away. He stumbled, rubbing his sore arms where the thorns had bitten deep. He was free, but not freed. Thorny guards remained close, their dark eyes watching his every move. He looked from the dying titan to the expectant, silent faces of the Florans, their bodies a canvas of wary, hopeful light. He was a man of science, stranded in a sentient jungle with no tools but his wits. The Grove Mother was dying, and somehow, against all odds, he had just promised to save her. Freedom, Aris quickly learned, was a relative concept. The vines had receded, but the prison had merely expanded to encompass the entire clearing. The thorn and bark Florans shadowed his every move, their postures radiating a vigilance that was a physical pressure against his back. He was a tolerated anomaly, a potential key to a lock he didn't understand, and his worth was as fragile as a dried leaf. His first priority was his gear. He gestured towards the pile of his discarded equipment, covered in the hardening, iridescent pollen. The elder root observed him, then pulsed a short, sharp command of white light. One of the bark Florans stomped over, used a clawed foot to unceremoniously kick the gear towards Aris, then retreated with a low grumble of grinding wood. Aris knelt, his heart sinking. The multi-tool was jammed solid, its mechanisms fused by the sticky residue. His bioscanner's display was a cracked, cloudy mess. He tapped his comm implant. Whisper, "Are you receiving?" A burst of static, then a fragmented reply. Signal degraded. environmental interference extreme, biochemical cloud attenuating. The pollen cloud hadn't just been a physical obstacle, it was a biochemical jammer. His last tether to his ship, to his world, was frayed to a whisper. He was truly on his own. The elder root seemed to sense his despair. It gestured with a gnarled limb, not at Aris, but at a younger, slimmer Floran who had been standing slightly apart. This one was different. Its body was composed of flexible, vine-like stems woven tightly together, covered in large, flat leaf pads that shifted subtly, orienting themselves like satellite dishes. They were a deep, photosynthetic green, but currently pulsed with curious, intermittent flecks of silver. Lumen. Lumen stepped forward, its movement a graceful, slinking motion. It emitted a soft, questioning pulse of cyan light towards the elder, who responded with a slower, affirming pulse of deep green. An assignment had been given. Lumen turned its attention to Aris. There was no face, no eyes, just those light-sensitive leaf pads and the overall humanoid shape. Yet Aris felt seen, assessed. Lumen pointed a slender, vine-like finger towards the edge of the clearing, then back at Aris, and began to walk. Their first foray into the jungle under guard was a lesson in terror and nuance. Aris quickly realized Lumen wasn't just a guard. It was a translator, a guide to the lethal grammar of Chromia. They approached a familiar patch of blade reeds. Aris instinctively froze, memories of their whip-crack recall fresh in his mind. Lumen paused, its leaf pads quivering. It then emitted a specific, high-frequency pulse of amber light. The effect was instantaneous. The reeds, which had been swaying gently, suddenly stiffened, their serrated edges vibrating, pointing outward like a phalanx of spears. A unified, silent threat. Danger, the concept formed in Aris's mind. The amber pulse wasn't a command to attack. It was a warning, a demonstration of the reed's defensive state. Lumen pulsed a different, softer frequency, and the reeds slowly relaxed. Follow. Safe path. Lumen's subsequent pulse of soft green seemed to say as it led Aris on a wide detour. Next, they neared a cluster of the enormous, pulsating lure blooms. The sweet, mind-numbing scent washed over them. Aris felt a wave of dizziness, a seductive pull to just lie down and rest. Lumen, unaffected, pulsed a deep, resonant blue light directly at the largest bloom. The flower flinched, its brilliant colors dimming, the trumpet-shaped head snapping shut with a soft, fleshy thump. Suppression. Control. Further on, the path was blocked by a thick, gray, web-like fungus that seemed to absorb the light. It looked inert, but something about its texture made Aris's skin crawl. Lumen pulsed a rapid, staccato sequence of pure white light. The fungus reacted, retracting from the light source like a vampire from the sun, pulling back to reveal a narrow path of bare, dark earth. Safe path. Light cleanses. Aris was beginning to understand. This wasn't a jungle of random aggression. It was a complex, interconnected society with its own rules, a language written in light, scent, and movement. The Florans weren't just living in the jungle, they were its stewards, its conductors. They used specific frequencies of light, a language the plants understood, to manage, warn, and manipulate the ecosystem. But the glitter blight didn't listen. It was a screeching, dissonant note in this silent symphony, a deaf parasite. They came to the edge of a sector where the blight had taken hold. The vibrant greens and golds were sickened with patches of weeping purple. A beautiful, tree-like growth with cascading curtains of phosphorescent moss was half consumed, the crystals jutting from its trunk like broken bones. The air here didn't hum with life. It vibrated with a faint, irritating buzz that set Aris's teeth on edge. Lumen's light patterns shifted, becoming agitated, tinged with a mournful violet. It pointed towards the infected tree, then to a cluster of small, unassuming, mushroom-like growths at the base of a healthy specimen nearby. They were a dull, mottled gray, easily overlooked. Saprophytic dissolvers. Lumen focused, its leaf pads orienting towards the mushrooms. It pulsed a very specific, complex pattern of ultraviolet light, invisible to Aris's eyes, but he saw the reaction. The mushrooms quivered, then began to excrete a thick, clear, gelatinous slime from their caps. With painstaking care, Lumen used a thin, tendril-like finger to gather a single, glistening droplet. It moved towards a small, isolated shard of glitter blight on a nearby leaf. It let the droplet fall. The reaction was violent. The shard hissed like a drop of water on a hot skillet, emitting a wisp of acrid, purple smoke. The crystal visibly corroded, bubbling and dissolving, until nothing was left but a smear of inert, gray dust on the leaf. Aris's breath caught in his throat, the weakness. "Whisper," he whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "Can you detect that? The enzymatic reaction?" A lag, then a broken signal. "Detected. Slime contains potent silicate-dissolving enzymes, highly specific to the glitter blight's organosilicate matrix. Efficacy extreme." He had it, the weapon. It was a biological key to a technological lock, but a single droplet against the massive infestation at the Grove Mother's base was like trying to put out a star with a cup of water. They needed an army of these mushrooms. They needed a way to deliver the slime en masse. His mind, trained in problem-solving and resource management, began to race, piecing together the tools he had been shown. The blade reeds could contain, the lure blooms could distract, the dissolvers could destroy. He turned to Lumen, his eyes alight with a new purpose. He pointed back towards the Grove Mother's clearing, then made a sweeping motion with his arms, mimicking a large-scale attack. He pointed at the dissolvers, then at the blight, and made a dissolving motion with his hands. Lumen watched, its leaf pads shifting, analyzing his crude pantomime. It pulsed a slow, thoughtful green, then a flicker of understanding cyan. It gestured for Aris to follow. Back in the great clearing, the scene was unchanged, the Grove Mother's weakened pulse a dirge. The elder root stood sentinel, its star flowers dim. Aris approached, Lumen at his side. He had no words, only concepts. He began to act out his plan, using Lumen as a reluctant intermediary. First, he pointed at the Thorne Florans, then at a stand of blade reeds at the clearing's edge. He mimed the Florans releasing pheromones, and then the reeds surging forward, forming a living wall. He drew a line in the air between the reeds and the edges of the blight infestation. Containment. The elder root watched, unmoving. Next, Aris pointed to the orchid Florans, then at the clusters of lure blooms surrounding the grove. He mimed the flowers opening, releasing their disorienting pollen clouds and pulsing their hypnotic lights. He then pointed at the central, thickest mass of the glitter blight and clutched his head, feigning confusion, distraction, sensory overload. A faint pulse of gold flickered within the elder's wooden chest. Finally, the crux of it. Aris pointed vigorously at Lumen, then at the ground where they'd seen the dissolvers. He mimed cultivating vast fields of the grey mushrooms. He then pantomimed dozens of vine Florans like Lumen carrying the dissolvers to the perimeter of the blight. He held up his broken multi-tool, then pointed at Lumen's light-emitting body, making a triggering motion towards the mushrooms. "We need to make your light portable. We need to trigger them all at once." He finished by miming the rain of slime, the violent dissolution of the crystals, and finally placed a hand on his own chest, then over his heart, facing the Grove Mother. A promise. The silence that followed was heavier than the vines that had bound him. The elder root was a statue of wood and light, processing the frantic, silent proposal. Aris could see the calculations happening behind that glowing moss gaze. It was a radical plan, using the jungle's own weapons in a coordinated, militaristic way he had never seen the Florans attempt. It was risky. It could fail. The Elder's gaze swept over its people, over the dying heart of their world. Then it turned back to Aris. Its core began to glow, a soft, determined gold that grew in intensity. It raised its gnarled limbs high, not in a question, but a declaration. A complex, commanding sequence of light erupted from the Elder, a rapid-fire series of patterns, colors, and pulses that shot out across the clearing like lightning. It was a call to arms. The effect was immediate. The previously despondent Florans snapped to attention. Their individual, mournful lights shifted, coalescing into unified, purposeful hues. The Thorn Florans began exuding thick, complex pheromones, moving towards the Bladereed stands. The Orchid Florans positioned themselves near the lure blooms, their own bodies beginning to cycle through preparatory light sequences. The Vine Florans, including Lumen, surged towards the jungle to begin the mass cultivation of the dissolvers. The grove, once a place of mourning, was now a war room preparing for a battle, the likes of which Chromia had never seen. Aris stood amidst the flurry of silent, light-pulsed activity, his own human heart hammering against his ribs. He had given them a plan. Now he had to help them build the final piece. He looked at his broken comm unit, then at Lumen. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Let's see if we can turn a whisper into a war cry." He picked up the gummed-up device, his scientist's mind already tearing it apart, seeking the one frequency that mattered. The UV pulse, the trigger for salvation. The plan was set in motion, a silent storm of botanical mobilization. The Florans worked with an efficiency that was breathtaking, their light-based communication allowing for a level of coordination that would have required hours of shouted commands for humans. Aris, however, faced a technological bottleneck. The dissolvers were the weapon, but the specific ultraviolet pulse was the trigger. Lumen and the other Vine Florans could produce it naturally, but to saturate the entire infestation, they needed to be everywhere at once. They needed amplifiers. His broken gear lay spread before him on a large, flat leaf that served as his workbench. The multi-tool was a lost cause, its microactuators permanently fused. The bioscanner was a paperweight, but his comm unit, while gummed up and its speaker shot, had a more robust internal structure. The core transmission chip, a wafer of crystalline silica, was designed to modulate energy across a wide spectrum of frequencies. If he could bypass the damaged external components and tap directly into that chip, he could theoretically use it to broadcast the ultraviolet pulse. The problem was power and precision. He had a single, low-yield power cell from the scanner, and he had no way to precisely calibrate the frequency without an interface. "Whisper," he murmured, hunching over the device, using a sharpened sliver of wood to carefully scrape pollen from the chip's contact points. "I need you to analyze Lumen's ultraviolet pulse. I'm going to try and create a hardline connection. Can you guide me?" "Affirmative. Signal strength is critical. Maintain proximity to the communication source." The AI's voice was a ghost in his skull, flickering in and out. He needed to be close to Lumen, the strongest natural emitter he had. He gestured to his guide, who was watching the disassembly with curious silver flecks dancing across its leaf pads. Aris pointed at Lumen, then at the open comm unit, and made a pleading gesture. Understanding, Lumen knelt beside him, its body humming with a low, ready energy. "Okay, Lumen, on my mark, emit the dissolver trigger, the full, precise sequence." He didn't know if it understood the words, but the intent now seemed to translate. He held 2 stripped wires from the comm unit's power cell, ready to touch them to the transmission chip. Now Lumen. Lumen focused, its leaf pads orienting towards the comm unit. A complex, shifting pattern of ultraviolet light, invisible but for a faint shimmer in the air, washed over the device. At the same moment, Aris touched the wires to the chip. A spark jumped. The comm unit let out a pained squeal of feedback that made Aris wince. "Pulse captured, data is corrupted. Attempting to isolate the core frequency," Whisper reported. "Power fluctuation detected, insufficient for sustained broadcast." It was a failure. The power cell was too weak, the signal too complex. He needed a different approach. He needed a Floran power source. His eyes fell on the clusters of bioluminescent moss adorning the bark Florans. They glowed with a steady, cold light, but that was just visible spectrum. He then remembered the lure blooms, their hypnotic pulses containing massive amounts of energy, and the thorn Florans with their cores of glowing, volatile amber sap. That sap pulsed with a deep, thermal energy. He turned to Lumen, a new idea forming. He pointed at a thorn Floran guard, then at the glowing sap visible through the cracks in its vine-woven body. He then mimed taking a small amount of that sap and placing it near his comm unit. Lumen's leaf pads flattened in a gesture Aris had come to recognize as alarm. It pulsed a sharp, warning red. Danger. "I know it's dangerous," Aris said, his voice low and earnest. "But its power, we need its power." He pointed desperately at the Grove Mother, whose golden light seemed to flicker more weakly than before. The blight was gaining ground for her. The word, the gesture, was a key. Lumen's resistance faded, replaced by a determined green. It approached the thorn Floran guard. A silent, light-based conversation ensued, too rapid for Aris to follow. The thorn Floran grumbled, amber sap bubbling within its core, but after a long moment, it extended a clawed hand. A single, glowing drop of thick, golden sap welled up from a fissure in its wrist and dripped onto a large leaf Lumen held ready. Lumen carried the leaf back to Aris as if it were holding a live explosive. The sap glowed with an intense inner heat, and a faint, spicy scent of cinnamon and ozone filled the air. Aris could feel the warmth radiating from it from a foot away. It was a biological power cell of incredible density. Now the delivery system. He couldn't use the fragile comm chip. The raw energy would fry it. He needed a conductor, something that could channel the energy and modulate it based on the chip's signal. His eyes landed on a shard of the glitter blight itself, lying inert nearby. It was an organosilicate crystal. It could, in theory, act as a resonant focus. It was a madman's plan, using the blight's own body against it, powered by the very lifeblood of the Florans. Working with frantic care, he used the wires to create a crude circuit. One end he embedded in the drop of amber sap. The other he carefully wound around the glitter blight shard. He then placed the comm chip, set to broadcast the captured ultraviolet frequency directly against the crystal. Whisper initiate broadcast on my mark. Lumen, be ready to show the dissolvers what to listen for. He took a deep breath. Mark. He completed the circuit. The drop of amber sap flared, its light intensifying from a soft glow to a fierce solar brilliance. The energy surged through the wires into the glitter blight shard. Instead of shattering, the purple crystal began to vibrate, humming at a high, piercing frequency. Then, projecting from its tip, a beam of pure, coherent ultraviolet light shot out, striking a cluster of dissolver mushrooms Lumen had placed a few feet away. The reaction was instantaneous and perfect. The mushrooms quivered and excreted their slime in a synchronized wave. He had done it, a crude, dangerous, but functional ultraviolet emitter. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. Lumen pulsed a brilliant, astonished gold, its leaf pads shivering with excitement. It quickly gathered the simple components, the sap power cell, the glitter blight focus, the comm chip trigger, and carried them to the Elder root. The Elder observed the demonstration, its starflowers brightening. Another rapid-fire series of light commands erupted from it. The Floran workforce shifted. Teams of Thorne Florans began carefully harvesting drops of their volatile sap. Others collected the inert glitter blight shards, and Vine Florans like Lumen worked with Aris to assemble the emitters, their delicate vine fingers proving surprisingly adept at the fine work. As they worked, a new sound began to rise from the jungle. It was a low, rhythmic grinding, like stone on stone. Aris looked up from his work to see the bark Florans gathered around the base of the Grove Mother. They were pressing their own bodies against her scarred bark, and as they did, the grinding sound intensified. They were exuding a different kind of sap, a dark, resinous substance that flowed into the cracks and wounds left by the blight, forming a hard, protective seal. They were bandaging their world tree, stem by stem. It was a gesture of profound connection and sacrifice that struck Aris to his core. This wasn't just about saving a resource, it was about saving a mother. Hours bled into a day. The clearing was transformed. The perimeter was now fortified with agitated blade reeds, held in check by vigilant Thorne Florans. Orchid Florans stood ready at their lure bloom stations, and a small army of Vine Florans, including Lumen, stood armed with the newly crafted ultraviolet emitters, each one holding the glowing amber sap and the humming purple crystal focus with a mixture of reverence and determination. The air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone, cinnamon, and damp earth. The final, sickly pulses of the blight seemed to beat faster, as if it sensed the impending assault. The Elder root stood beside Aris on a great, arched root that provided a view of the entire battlefield. It placed a gnarled, warm limb on Aris's shoulder. It was no longer the touch of a jailer, but of a fellow general. Then, the Elder raised its limbs high, its star flowers blazing like a constellation brought to earth. It was time. The silent war for the heart of Chromia was about to begin. A silence fell upon the grove, deeper than any Aris had experienced. It was the quiet of a drawn breath, the calm in the eye of a storm. The very air seemed to thicken, charged with the potential of the coming violence. From his vantage point on the high, arched root beside the elder root, Aris had a panoramic view of the battlefield. The massive blight infestation pulsed at the base of the Grove Mother, a malevolent purple heart beating in time with the tree's own weakened, golden rhythm. It was a grotesque parody of life, a crystalline cancer. The elder root stood immobile, a general surveying the field. Then it began. A single sharp pulse of crimson light shot from the elder's core, a silent flare igniting the battle. This was Phase 1, containment. The Thorne Florans, stationed at the edges of the clearing, responded instantly. They unleashed clouds of complex, astringent pheromones towards the dense stands of blade reeds. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The forest of blades, previously swaying in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, came alive with a unified, lethal purpose. With a sound like 1,000 swords being drawn at once, the reeds surged forward. They didn't uproot themselves, but their stems elongated, their serrated edges snapping outwards, forming a living, vibrating palisade around the perimeter of the infestation. They began to press inward, herding the creeping edges of the blight, slashing at any crystalline tendrils that tried to spread beyond the main mass. It was a brutal, botanical siege, containing the parasite against the immovable bulk of the Grove Mother's trunk. The blight reacted. Where the blade reeds made contact, the purple crystals snapped and splintered, but the shards burrowed into the soil, attempting to regrow. The containment was holding, but it was a battle of attrition the reeds couldn't win forever. The elder root pulsed a second command, a swirling pattern of gold and blue. This was Phase 2, distraction. The orchid Florans raised their delicate, flower-headed forms. In unison, they emitted piercing, complex sequences of light directed at the clusters of lure blooms positioned around the grove. The giant flowers, which had been closed and dormant, snapped open with a sound like wet canvas tearing. Torrents of thick, iridescent pollen erupted into the air, forming a shimmering, disorienting fog that rolled over the central mass of the blight. Simultaneously, the blooms began to pulse with blinding, rapid-fire patterns of color: scarlet, cyan, violet, magenta, a hypnotic strobe effect designed to overload any sensory capacity. Aris saw it immediately. The central core of the blight, which had been pulsing with a focused, predatory energy, suddenly became erratic. Its light flashes became jagged, unsynchronized. Crystalline tendrils that had been questing towards the containing blade reeds retracted, flailing uselessly in the pollen-choked air. The parasite was confused, its crude, reactive intelligence overwhelmed by the sensory onslaught. It was now focused inward, on the disorienting assault, blind to the true threat being assembled. "This is it," Aris said quietly, his hands clenched into fists. He turned to the elder root, who met his gaze. The ancient Floran's light was a steady, unwavering gold. It gave a single, slow nod. Aris took a deep breath, the cloying sweetness of the pollen making him lightheaded. He raised his arm, pointing directly at the heart of the writhing, distracted blight. "Now," he yelled, his voice a raw human sound that was utterly alien in the silent symphony of light. This was Phase 3, dissolution. Lumin and the army of Vine Florans surged forward. They moved with a silent, fluid grace, carrying clusters of the gray, unassuming saprophytic dissolver mushrooms. They positioned themselves at the very edge of the blade-reed containment line, ignoring the slashing blades and the disorienting pollen fog. This was the moment of supreme vulnerability and trust. As one, they raised the crude UV emitters. The drops of amber sap flared with stolen power, channeling through the purloined glitter blight shards. Dozens of beams of invisible ultraviolet light lanced out, striking the clusters of dissolvers they carried. The reaction was not a slow oozing, but a violent eruption. Triggered en masse, the mushrooms excreted their clear, enzymatic slime in a torrent. The vine Florans, with precise, sweeping motions, hurled the slime-saturated clusters directly onto the central mass of the glitter blight. The sound that followed was not of this world. It was a high-pitched, collective shriek, a grating, crystalline vibration transmitted through the ground and air that felt like needles driven into Aris's teeth. Where the slime landed, the blight did not just melt, it screamed into oblivion. The purple crystals fizzed and boiled, dissolving in violent, hissing clouds of acrid, purple-gray dust. The dissolution spread like wildfire across the infestation, consuming the parasite in a wave of biological cleansing. But the blight fought back. Even in its death throes, it was dangerous. A large central crystal, perhaps a nexus of the infestation, managed to focus its energy. It pulsed a wave of disruptive force that shattered several of the UV emitters in the hands of the nearest vine Florans. Amber sap spattered and ignited, and a Floran cried out in a grating shriek of wood and pain as its vine arm was scorched. Another tendril of crystal, untouched by the slime, shot out from the dissolving mass, aiming directly for Lumen, who was focused on triggering another cluster. "Lumen, look out!" Aris screamed, a useless warning. But the Florans were not without their own defenses. The bark Floran guards, who had been standing as a final reserve, surged forward. One interposed its own body between the crystal and Lumen. The sharp shard impaled itself deep into the bark Floran's woody torso. It grunted, a sound of splitting timber, but did not falter. It wrapped its powerful, root-like hands around the crystal, and with a final, monumental effort, tore it free, even as the disruptive energy blackened its bark. It collapsed, its bioluminescent moss patterns flickering and dying. The sacrifice bought a precious second. Mori vine Florans pressed the attack, fearlessly moving into the dissolving cloud, placing dissolvers directly onto the most stubborn patches. The Grove Mother herself seemed to feel the turning tide. Her vast, pained shuddering ceased. The weak, flickering golden pulse at her base strengthened, brightening from a dying ember to a steady, warm glow. The light spread, pushing back against the disintegrating blight, actively helping to purge the corruption from her bark. Her branches high above shuddered, and a rain of glowing, golden leaves drifted down like a benediction, settling over the Florans and the dissolving enemy alike. Within what felt like both an eternity and a single heartbeat, the battle was over. The cancerous scar was gone. The air, once buzzing with malevolent energy, was clear, carrying only the scent of ozone, dissolved crystal, and the returning, healthy scent of damp earth and living wood. The lure blooms, their purpose served, snapped shut. The blade reeds, their aggression no longer needed, stilled and retracted, becoming once again mere plants at the forest's edge. The silence returned, but this time it was a silence of awe, of relief, of exhaustion. The Florans stood amidst the settling dust of their vanquished foe, their bodies streaked with sap and soot. They looked at the Grove Mother, at the scarred but healing bark, at the strong, steady pulse of golden light that now thrummed through the clearing with the power of a restored heartbeat. Then, one by one, they turned their lights towards Aris. The elder root placed both gnarled limbs on Aris's shoulders. It then raised them high to the canopy, and a complex, beautiful pattern of pure white light, interspersed with vibrant gold and deep, life-affirming green, pulsed across its form. It was a pattern of gratitude, of acceptance, of a bond forged in the crucible of battle. All around the clearing, the Florans responded. Each added their own unique hues and patterns, the orchids with soft, pulsing violets and blues, the thorns with fierce, proud scarlets and ambers, the vines with shimmering, joyful cyans and silvers. The bark Florans, even the wounded, managed a low, steady pulse of respect. The grove filled with a silent, radiant salute, a symphony of light washing over Aris, bathing him in their wordless thanks. Lumen stepped forward from the crowd. In its vine-like hands, it held a single, perfect blossom from a plant that had, hours before, been part of the jungle's deadly arsenal. The flower glowed with a soft, gentle blue light, the color of trust, of peace. It offered the blossom to Aris. He took it, his grimy, human hands trembling as they closed around the delicate, luminous stem. It was cool to the touch, and its light seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He looked from the flower to the colossal, living tree, its golden light now strong and steady, a beacon in the vibrant, dangerous, and now saved jungle. He had come as a stranger, a suspect, a bearer of unwanted technology. He had fought with their weapons, spoken their language, and earned his place not as an invader, but as a gardener. The war was over. The silence, once accusing, now spoke of a future he could never have imagined. The days that followed the battle were a study in quiet transformation. The grim tension that had choked the grove had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of recuperation, and for Aris, a tentative belonging. He was no longer the metal-scented blight bringer, but the light bringer, the gardener. He saw it in the way the Florans' light pulses softened when he passed, in the way the thorn guards no longer shadowed his every step, but merely nodded, their grating sounds now a sign of respect. His quarters had been upgraded from a patch of moss under watchful eyes to a small, sheltered alcove formed by the great, buttressing roots of the Grove Mother herself. The air here hummed with her restored energy, a deep, resonant thrum that was both soothing and empowering. The single, glowing blossom Lumen had given him was nestled in a crevice, its soft blue light a constant, comforting presence. But the victory was not absolute. The glitter blight was purged from the heart tree, but the jungle was vast, and the parasite was tenacious. Scattered infestations remained, smaller wounds on the body of Chromia that needed cleansing. The work continued, but it was no longer a desperate last stand. It was methodical healing. Aris worked alongside Lumen and small teams of vine Florans, his crude UV emitters now standard kit. They would locate an infected zone, and Aris would watch, fascinated, as the Florans performed a silent triage. They didn't just attack the blight, they communed with the sickened flora, their light pulses shifting to frequencies of inquiry and comfort. They seemed to be listening. Whisper, are you recording all this? The specific light sequences correlated with plant species and health status. Whisper said, affirmative, Doctor. Data stream is stable. Environmental interference has lessened by 78% since the Grove Mother's recovery. Pattern analysis, suggests a form of photonic resonance, allowing for the transfer of complex information. It was more than just giving commands, it was a dialogue. Aris began to experiment. He pointed at a vine scarred by the blight, then at a healthy one nearby, and pulsed a simple, questioning green with a handheld light crystal Lumen had given him. The healthy vine responded with a faint, answering shimmer. It was a child's first word in a new language, but it was a start. The true breakthrough came when the elder root summoned him. It led him not to another battlefield, but deeper into the grove, to a place where the grove mother's roots formed a natural amphitheater. The air was thick with the smell of rich loam and something else, a sharp electric scent. The ground was covered in a vast, intricate web of bioluminescent fungus, a mycelial network that pulsed with a slow, galaxy-wide light, connecting every root, every plant, in a sprawling, subterranean tapestry. In the center of this web sat the elder, its gnarled form seeming to draw energy from the glowing filaments. Lumen was there, and through a combination of simple light pulses and pantomime, the purpose of the place became clear. This was the Nexus, the Florans' internet, their library, their collective memory. It was how they coordinated across vast distances, how knowledge was preserved, how the Grove Mother spoke to her children. The elder root gestured for Aris to sit. Then it placed a single, woody digit on the glowing mycelial web and pointed at Aris's head. Aris's breath caught. "You want to show me?" A slow, confirming pulse of white light. Hesitantly, Aris reached out and touched the web. It was not like hearing or seeing. It was a flood of knowing, a torrent of information that bypassed his senses and imprinted directly onto his consciousness. He saw the history of Chromia not as dates, but as sensations, the first pulse of life from the Grove Mother's seed, the slow, patient weaving of the ecosystem, the rise of the Florans as stewards. He felt the sharp, painful sting of the glitterblight's first appearance, a silent, shattering scream from a distant part of the forest that echoed through the network. He felt the Florans' confusion, their fear, their failed attempts to cure it. And he saw himself, not as a physical form but as a presence, a strange, hard-shelled creature emitting unfamiliar energy signatures. He felt their initial hostility, a defensive flare in the network. Then the shift, his determination at the Grove Mother's base, the spark of understanding with Lumen, the brilliant, dangerous idea of the UV emitters, the shared triumph of the battle. He felt their perception of his emotions, his fear, his ingenuity, his resolve, his awe. It was overwhelming. He pulled his hand back, gasping, his mind reeling. He had learned more about the Florans in that 10-second connection than in all his weeks of study. The elder root pulsed with soft, understanding light. It had not given him data, it had given him context. It had shown him that the glitter blight wasn't just a physical disease, it was a scream of static in their song, a severing of connections, a profound loneliness. This changed everything. His scientific, problem-solving mind began to recalibrate. The goal wasn't just to eliminate a pathogen, it was to heal a wound in a conscious world. He turned to the elder, his own crude light crystal in hand. He pulsed a sequence he had been practicing, an image of the glitter blight, followed by a question mark, and then a sweeping gesture towards the jungle beyond the grove. Where did it come from? The elder's light dimmed, its star flowers seeming to droop. It touched the network again, and another wave of knowing washed over Aris. This one was different. It was fragmented, blurred with static and pain. He saw images of a place where the jungle grew twisted and silent, a region where the light of Flora Lux struck the planet unfiltered, where the ground was a cracked, metallic plain, littered with strange, angular stones that were not stone. And there, at the center of the blight, a shard. Not a small, infecting crystal, but a monolith, a source. It pulsed with a familiar, malevolent purple light, and from it, the glitter blight spread like a tide. The origin point, the seed. Aris pulled back, his heart pounding. The scattered infestations they were cleaning up were just symptoms. They were pruning branches while the root festered. Until that monolith was destroyed, the blight would always return. He looked at the elder, then at Lumen, whose leaf pads were tilted in concern. He pointed firmly in the direction the vision had indicated, then made the sign for the blight and the sign for destruction. We have to go to the source. The elder root was silent for a long time, the galaxy of mycelial light pulsing around it. The cost of the battle for the Grove Mother had been high. A journey to the heart of the blight would be a far greater peril. It would mean leaving the mother's protective aura, venturing into a corrupted land where their connection to the network would be weak, perhaps severed. Finally, a complex, resigned, yet determined pattern of light flowed from the elder. It was not a command, but a question directed at the entire grove. A call for volunteers for a suicide mission. Without a moment's hesitation, Lumen stepped forward, its body blazing with a fierce emerald light. Another Thorne Floran, the one who had donated the sap for the first emitter, grunted and stepped out of the shadows. A bark Floran, its torso still scarred from the battle, stamped a heavy foot in agreement. The silent answer was given. Aris looked at the small, brave assembly. He was no longer a gardener tending a wound. He was a soldier preparing for a final, decisive strike. He had been given the gift of their history, their memory, their very soul. Now, he had to help them secure their future. He picked up his UV emitter, the amber sap within still glowing with a faint, warm light. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go find the root of this rot." The vibrant, perilous jungle that had once been his prison was now his home to defend, and the silent language of light his only weapon for the war to come. The journey to the blight's origin was a descent into a nightmare version of Chromia. The further they traveled from the Grove Mother, the more the vibrant, humming life of the jungle faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. The air grew thin and stale, losing its complex cocktail of scents, carrying only the dry, metallic tang of dust and decay. The multi-hued canopy gave way to a sickly, grayish haze, the light from Flora Lux leaching the color from the world. Their party was small, forged in the fire of the previous battle. Aris Lumen, the Thorne Floran he'd privately named Grumble, and the scarred bark Floran Bastion. They moved with a grim purpose, Lumen scouting ahead, its leaf pads constantly shifting, sampling the dead air. Grumble's amber core burned with a low, wary light, and Bastion's heavy footfalls were the only solid sound in the eerie quiet. Aris felt the absence of the Grove Mother's hum like a physical ache. It was a withdrawal symptom from a world soul he hadn't known he was connected to. His own spirit felt muted. Worse, his connection to Whisper, which had strengthened after the great tree's healing, began to falter again. "Signal degradation increasing," Whisper said, its voice a frayed thread in his mind. "Background disruptive energy rising." "The blight is stronger here," Aris murmured, more to himself than to the others. "It's not just killing the plants, It's killing the connection, the network itself. Lumen pulsed a soft, agreeing violet. It pointed ahead where the twisted, skeletal remains of trees stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. The ground was no longer soft moss, but a cracked hardpan of pale clay littered with those strange, angular stones he'd seen in the vision. He knelt, brushing the dust from one. It wasn't stone. It was corroded metal, pitted and ancient, a piece of a strut, a fragment of a hull. Recognition, cold and sharp, stabbed through him. This wasn't a natural place. This was a crash site, an ancient starship crash site. The monolith, he whispered. It's not a natural formation. It's the ship's core, its power source. The glitter blight wasn't a native parasite. It was a technological plague, a runaway energy matrix from a dead starship, mutating and consuming the organic life of Chromia, converting it into a crystalline reflection of itself. The Florans' instinct had been right all along. The blight was tech, just not his. The revelation fueled a new dread. How do you fight a disease when the disease is the ghost of a machine? They pressed on, the landscape becoming more grotesque. They saw plants frozen mid-motion, sheathed entirely in purple crystal, like exhibits in a museum of death. There were no blade reeds to contain them here, no lure blooms to distract. This was the blight's sovereign territory. Finally, they saw it. In the center of a vast, barren crater, it stood, the monolith. It was a towering, obsidian-black spire, jagged and unnatural, clearly the central spine of the ruined vessel. But it was now encased in, or had somehow become, a pulsating, living core of glitter blight. This was no collection of shards. It was a single, massive, beating heart of purple light, veins of malevolent energy crawling across its surface. The disruptive buzz was a physical force here, a pressure against the eardrums and the mind. The air shimmered with heat and distortion. "Warning," Whisper said, its voice barely a flicker. "Energy readings critical, source of disruptive field, neural hazard." Aris felt a headache blooming behind his eyes, a nausea that had nothing to do with smell. Lumen's light was flickering erratically, and Grumble was emitting a low, continuous growl of distress. Bastion stood firm, but the moss patterns on its bark were dim. They couldn't get close. The very air around the monolith was a weapon. "This is it," Aris said, his voice hoarse. "The source, but we can't just throw dissolvers at it. It'll fry us before we get within 100 meters." He looked at the UV emitter in his hand, the amber sap glowing bravely. It was a pebble against a fortress. His scientific mind raced, analyzing the problem. The blight was an energetic entity, a corrupted power source. It defended itself with an intense, disruptive field. They needed to overload it, short it out. They needed a capacitor, a battery to absorb the shock and reflect it back. His eyes moved from the emitter to Grumble, whose volatile sap core pulsed with contained energy. To Bastion, a living shield. To Lumen, a conduit of light and information. And then he saw it. The plan, desperate and insane, formed in his mind. It wasn't a plan of destruction, but of redirection, of healing the machine's ghost. He gathered the Florans, using his light crystal and frantic pantomime to paint the picture. He pointed at the monolith, then at the UV emitters. He then pointed at Grumble and mimed all of them channeling their energy, their light, their sap, their very life force, into a single focused beam, using the emitters as a lens. They wouldn't be attacking the blight with a foreign substance. They would be overwhelming its corrupted signal, with a pure, concentrated burst of Chromia's own energy, the energy of the Grove Mother, carried by her children. It was a prayer, a hymn of light fired like a bullet. The Florans understood the risk. To channel that much energy would be to offer themselves as a conduit. It could burn them out, shatter them. Lumen looked from the monstrous monolith back to Aris, and its leaf pads settled into a posture of absolute resolve. It pulsed a single, brilliant white word: yes. Grumble slammed a thorny fist into his other palm, sap bubbling eagerly. Bastion simply knelt, planting its hands on the dead ground, making itself a grounding rod, an anchor. There was no time for a better plan. The disorienting effects were growing stronger. Aris's vision was beginning to blur at the edges. They formed a line, Bastion at the rear, Grumble before him, then Lumen, and Aris at the front, holding his emitter. He modified it quickly, using wires from his broken gear to link it to Lumen's back, creating a circuit. Lumen placed its vine hands on Grumble's shoulders, and Grumble placed his claws on Bastion's bark. "On my mark," Aris yelled, his voice swallowed by the monolith's hum. "For the Grove Mother, for Chromia." He focused on the image of the great tree, on its golden, healing light, on the memory of the silent symphony in the grove. He poured that feeling, that memory, into his intention. And now, he triggered his emitter. The effect was not a beam, but a tsunami. Grumble roared as the energy ripped through him, his amber core flaring into a miniature sun. The power surged into Lumen, whose body became incandescent, a being of pure white-hot light, its form barely visible. The energy focused through Aris's emitter, but it wasn't just UV light. It was a composite beam containing the entire spectrum of Floran life: Grumble's fierce vitality, Lumen's intelligent resonance, Bastion's unwavering stability, and Aris's own desperate human hope. The beam, a rope of braided light, lanced across the crater and struck the heart of the monoliths. The world turned white. The monolith's shrieking reached a deafening crescendo. Purple and gold light warred, swirling around the spire in a violent vortex. Aris felt as if his bones were vibrating apart. He held on, his teeth gritted, his hands blistering on the hot crystal of his emitter. He saw Lumen shudder, its light flickering, saw Grumble's core dim dangerously, felt Bastion's grounding presence waver. They were failing. The blight's energy was too vast. No, the thought was a final, defiant spark. He reached deeper, not into his knowledge, but into his connection. He thought of the mycelial network, the shared memory of a world. He wasn't one man, he was a node, a conduit for an entire planet. As if hearing his silent plea, a final, massive surge of energy flowed through them. It was green and gold and alive. It was the Grove Mother, lending her strength across the vast distance, her roots touching the network touching Lumen, completing the circuit. The combined force was the final key. The purple light of the monolith shattered. There was no slow dissolution. There was a silent, expanding wave of pure, cleansing white. It washed over the crater, and where it touched, the glitter blight didn't dissolve, it transformed. The purple crystals shifted, their malevolent light softening, clearing, becoming prisms that reflected the true light of Flora Lux. The obsidian spire of the monolith remained, but the pulsating heart of the blight was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady, rainbow-hued glow. The disruptive field vanished. The silence that returned was no longer dead, but peaceful. Aris collapsed to his knees, exhausted. His emitter was a melted lump in his hands. He looked back. Lumen was slumped, its light dim but steady. Grumble was on one knee, his core a calm, slow pulse. Bastion remained standing, a silent, unbreakable monument. They had done it. As Aris watched, a tiny green shoot pushed its way through a crack in the clay at the base of the transformed monolith. Life was already returning. Log entry: Dr. Aris Thorne, supplemental, stardate 752.8. The silence is different now. It's the silence of a wound closed, a fever broken. The glitter blight is gone, not destroyed, but healed. The ghost in the machine has been laid to rest. I sit now in the great grove. The grove mothers pulse a strong, steady rhythm in my bones. Lumen rests nearby, its light patterns slow and content. We are both scarred, both changed. They have offered me a place here. The elder root has shown me a sapling, a child of the grove mother they wish me to tend, a human gardener for an alien world. My ship will remain in orbit, a silent tomb for a life I no longer recognize. Whisper's data banks are full, a record of my findings. Perhaps one day another will come. They will find no colony, no resource to exploit. They will find a world that defends itself and a keeper who has learned its language. The tech failed, the forest fought, and in the end I did not conquer Chromia. I took root. My mission is over. My work has just begun. The petals are no longer perilous, they are home.